Hello, everyone. I'm Rick Dunham. I am the Washington Bureau Chief for the Houston Chronicle and Hearst newspapers. I was the White House correspondent for Business Week magazine at the time of the Clinton presidency, and this was quite a trip down memory lane. In my extracurricular life, I'm the president of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, which is the educational and charitable arm of the National Press Club, and we try to do programs like this that talk about journalism issues and journalism excellence. And this film is definitely an example of journalism excellence and movie-making excellence. I strongly recommend that you watch all 4 hours of it on PBS when it's on next month. I sort of wish there were a director's cut, the 10-hour version, so we could see everything. But let me turn this over to our all-star panel. What I will do is introduce them, and then everyone will have a chance to make introductory remarks, and then I'll start out with some questions, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So let me start right here. Right next to me is Barak Goodman. Barak has been writing, producing, and directing documentaries for more than 15 years. His most recent film for American Experience was My Lai, winner of both the Peabody Award and the 2010 Emmy for Outstanding Direction. Other American Experience projects that he's done include The Boy in the Bubble, The Lobotomist, The Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and Scottsboro, An American Tragedy, which was nominated for an Academy Award. Mr. Goodman's additional credits include A Hidden Life and The Persuaders for PBS's Frontline, and Einstein's Letter for the History Channel's 10 Days That Changed the World. In addition to the awards that I've mentioned already, he's a recipient of the DuPont Columbia Award, the RFK Journalism Prize, and twice has been invited to premiere his films at Sundance Film Festival. Next to him, we have David Maraniss. And hold on a second. He's the associate editor of the Washington Post and author of 5 critically acclaimed best-selling books about just about everything: history, politics, and sports. His next book, which is called Barack Obama, The Story, not to be confused with Barak Goodman, the director, will be published in June. Among the projects that he's done are, let's see, First in His Class, of course, about Bill Clinton, biography of Bill Clinton, which is just an amazing book. If any of you haven't read it, I'd recommend that you get that and read it in preparation for the documentary. Rome, 1960, the Summer Olympics that stirred the world. And one of my special favorites, Clemente, the Passion and Grace of Baseball's last hero, Roberto Clemente. And When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. The Lombardi biography, which is winner of the Frankfurt International Book Prize, was hailed by Sports Illustrated as, quote, maybe the best sports biography ever published. Next to David, we have Michael Isikoff, who you saw in the preview there, and you'll see a lot more of next month. He is a national investigative correspondent for NBC News. He joined NBC in July 2010 as national investigative correspondent. Before then, he'd been at Newsweek since 1994 as an investigative correspondent, and he earlier worked at the Washington Post with my wife, Pam. He's written extensively on the US government's war on terrorism. I'm sure you've seen so many of his stories over the years: the Abu Ghraib scandal, campaign finance, and congressional ethics abuses. I mean, almost every big story in Washington, he's right in the middle of. Presidential politics and other national issues. At Newsweek.com, his blog, Declassified, investigative reporting in real time, written with my University of Pennsylvania classmate, Mark Hosenball, became a must-read for senior US government officials and members of the public alike. He's the author of 2 best-selling books, Hubris, The Inside Story of Spin Scandal and the Selling of the Iraq War, co-written with David Korn, and Uncovering Clinton, A Reporter's Story, which I also recommend for your reading list before you watch this documentary. It's an amazing look inside the Clinton White House and the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Since the terror attacks on September 1st, 2001, Michael's broken repeated stories about the U.S. government's war on terror. He's won numerous journalism awards, and including National Magazine Award for General Excellence, Society of Professional Journalists Award for coverage of Abu Ghraib, and on and on. And batting cleanup, we have Mark Samels, executive producer of The American Experience. And under his leadership, the series has been honored with nearly every industry award there is, including Peabody Primetime Emmys, DuPont Columbia Journalism Award, Writers Guild Awards, Oscar nominations, Sundance Film Festival Audience and Grand Jury Awards. He also serves on the Board of Governors of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. And prior to joining WGBH, he worked as an independent documentary filmmaker and executive producer for several U.S. public television stations, and a producer for the first co-production between Japanese and American television. So thank you to our all-star panel, and why don't I turn it over to our filmmaker to start.
You'd like me to say a few words?
If you'd like to, yes.
Okay.
Why don't we do this? Why don't you just talk about the making of the documentary, and let me throw it out this way. I mean, you have so many superstars of the Clinton era in it. How did you decide who you were going to interview and who you were not?
Well, we tried to get interviews with absolutely everybody. That was my solution. We really didn't discriminate too much. We actually ended up interviewing over 70 people, not all of whom are in the film, but most of whom are in the film. We got great access, mostly because the Clinton Foundation early on decided, though we didn't seek an interview with the President or the First Lady, they decided early on that it was probably in their interest to cooperate. They understood PBS's reputation and the reputation of American Experience, and they gave the green light. And there were several dozen people who would probably not have spoken to us had they not received that blessing. So, you know, we tried to get people who were as close to the action as possible, and we got very few no's. There were maybe half a dozen folks who declined interviews.
So, well, two themes emerged as I watched the documentary. One is this comeback kid, and the second is eventually wasted opportunities. They tie in together. So if you could start, and then we could go down the row. Can you talk about those two themes and how they may be intertwined?
Yeah, it's sort of unmistakable in Clinton's career path if you take any time to look at it. The sort of roller coaster ride, the ups and the downs. He was remarkably resilient, at his best, I think, when he was in the most trouble. And you saw that over and over again. And somehow restive and restless when he was succeeding. And as someone in the film says, it was just a matter of, you know, when he was on top, it was just a matter of time before you knew the next scandal would pop up or the next imbroglio would happen. But, you know, so it was sort of inevitable that would become the main thrust of the film. And I actually early on, there was no doubt it was going to be called Clinton, but I had a fantasy that it might be called The 9 Lives of Bill Clinton or something like that, because he literally had that many near-death experiences as a politician. And Hillary really, I think, can be credited more than anyone else with pulling him through many of those near-death experiences. She was the secret weapon in the White House, and you know, his main support through much of that.
And when everyone here watches the documentary, it's amazing to watch Hillary Clinton propping him up, saving his hide so many times, and then to see that moment that just seems to be caught in freeze frame of leaving for Martha's Vineyard the day after he confessed to her the affair, and Chelsea holding both of their hands because the two of them weren't talking to each other, or Hillary wasn't talking to him. So it's just remarkable. Let's go down to David Maraniss, and if you can just talk a little about those two threads.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, especially people who supported Clinton, think about it in terms of wasted opportunity. And that is undoubtedly true, but it's also, it's beside the point in a sense. My conviction after studying him for so many years was that the very same impulses and tendencies that allowed him to do good also brought him into trouble. And you could not separate them. So he never would have been president. He never would have had that idealistic drive, which is also a part of his nature, without the impulses that drove him in other directions. And so I think that the documentary, beyond the half an hour that you saw tonight, explores that in a pretty powerful way.
Yep.
And so,
And Michael?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's really gripping TV. I mean, somebody who's now. Oh, I'm sorry. Is this not? How's that?
Is that better?
We okay? Yeah. Anyway, it's gripping television as somebody now in the television world, who struggles to get, a 2-minute spot on nightly news to watch a really in-depth, nuanced documentary like this. I was just envious at how much you were able to get in and how well and powerful it was. I mean, to me, what leapt out is, obviously the trip down memory lane and watching the whole Monica thing and all, but the second hour about the first 2 years of Clinton's presidencies and the parallels with Obama's. Right. I mean, the budget battles, healthcare, the political enemies who don't consider him a legitimate president, the Republican takeover of the Congress in the election, in the congressional elections, was just, I mean, I think it really gives you a new perspective on both the Clinton presidency and the Obama presidency to see how much they replay each other. So that's what leapt out at me most. I have a few quibbles with the Lewinsky part of it and the Whitewater part of it, and a couple of substantive criticisms not related to that. But I'll leave that till later. So.
And we'll
Disappointed you did.
Yeah. Okay.
And we'll come back to Clinton, Obama in a little while. But
it's a great movie.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask Mark what you think. You've done a lot as executive producer of American Experience. What makes this documentary stand out?
Thank you all for coming. I think we're just about done, right? No, I think the opportunity here, this is our 15th presidential biography. We've done about 300 films for PBS over our 23 years. So I too, which you were pointing out, Michael, I'm grateful every year that we get a chance to bring this to the American public. So on behalf of all my colleagues, or I want to thank all my colleagues from PBS for coming tonight. Promise, achievement, crisis, fall, comeback. It's a graph of a Shakespeare character. And you so seldom are handed that in a figure. And when you really look at the underlying human and dramatic potential of Bill Clinton, whether you like his politics or not, you have to realize that, entwined in all of us are those dark and light forces. And there's so much alive in him that he's in some ways, a lot of people have commented on the fact that, we may be living in a time of diminished figures. We look so fondly into our past, reach back to for some to Reagan, for others to FDR, and then further back to the 19th century. But I think over time, there will be some people, and Clinton's a candidate, who may rise as a bigger-than-life figure. And that's the potential that he represents.
And I'd like to ask David Maraniss, you finished your book on President Obama, to talk a little about what Michael Isikoff had mentioned, the parallels, what we're living through today versus the Clinton years, and then the difference in the personalities of President Obama and President Clinton.
It's fascinating in that sense, and that Michael's exactly right. The echoes are eerie, the parallels of the first 2 years in all the ways that he cited. And yet, you can't think of two people who went through similar struggles and came out in different places. Both Clinton and Obama came out of dysfunction, personal dysfunction, their families. And Clinton got through it by just plowing forward constantly his whole life, just pushing things out of the way, keep going, Tomorrow's a new day. I'll get up, forgive myself, forgive the world, and keep going. And so that got him to the White House. And when it got him to the White House, it got him in trouble, but also gave him the capability to survive and at various times to figure out in a very keen way what it took to beat Gingrich's clock and everything else, because he'd been so trained in that by just pushing forward. Obama came out of even more dysfunction, and he spent 9 years of his young life figuring it out, methodically, intellectually, internally, for 9 years. He came out of that ready to go into politics, and that drove him to the White House, just as Clinton's plowing did. And then once he got to the White House, it created different problems for him. If I figured it out, why can't everybody else? That leads to his caution, to his, the whole, this is, it's not a red America or blue America. And that created the problem. So even once they got there, they faced many of the similar stations of the cross in those first 2 years and ended up in the same difficult place with completely different personalities.
Yeah, and Michael Isikoff, you had mentioned Shakespearean character. Sorry. Well, I'll give Mark, you mentioned it, but I'm going to ask Michael. We had our
Okay.
false staff.
He can steal it. That's
I mean, we had false staff and a few other characters.
Yeah.
Newt Gingrich, Ken Starr, who all seemed to come out of Shakespeare as well. I was wondering, covering it the way you were and dealing close up with all these people, both then and Newt Gingrich since, what the clash of personalities was like. And then, since I've been covering the presidential race and just got back from New Hampshire, I've been watching Newt close up. Does he have 9 lives? Or is he on his 12th life now? Why has he not achieved what Clinton achieved?
I'm sure Clinton's going to watch that, and particularly the part about, the affair with Monica begins during the budget battle and sort of plants the seed for his further troubles. And of course, Newt was having an affair at the same time.
That's right. And you saw his wife there in the White House standing next.
A much longer.
His second one.
His second wife was standing next to him as Bill Clinton was looking into his eyes.
That's one of them. I missed that. Callista's in
Yeah.
there?
Oh, yeah.
No, number
No,
two.
no. Marianne.
Oh, Maraniss.
Callista was in Steve Gunderson's
I think
office.
she was look, you can't invent the characters. They are.
Well, Linda Tripp too. Why don't I ask about Linda Tripp too? She's an important character in this, but there's not a ton of time spent on her because we only have 4 hours here. Tell us something about Linda. Tell us something about Linda Tripp if you were doing an American experience on her.
Well, actually, one of my quibbles is that just in this excerpt here, the impression is left, I think, that it's after she goes to Lucianne Goldberg and they begin the taping, and then Goldberg suggests they reach out to me. In fact, I'd been talking to Linda Tripp months earlier. I stumbled upon her on my own, looking into the Kathleen Willey story. Kathleen Willey was another character who popped up as somebody who had alleged that Clinton had made sexual advances to her while he was in the White House. And in fact, I always thought that was potentially the most explosive of all, because it was an allegation of sexual harassment. And it was inside the Oval Office, and it was while he was president. And I had tracked her down in Richmond and spent some time trying to find her and listening to her story and trying to check it out. And one of the things you always do is ask, well, who is there you talk to about the time about this? And she said, well, there is this one woman who was working at the White House at the time who I told about it that day. And who's that? And she said, Linda Tripp. And, who's Linda Tripp? Where is she? I think she works in the Pentagon right now. And I, tried to figure out how am I going to approach this woman, Linda Tripp. I looked up, saw she had worked in the Bush White House and for a time in the Clinton White House. And finally had my then colleague at Newsweek, John Barry, get me into the Pentagon with his pass, and I just like went up to her and tracked her down, went up to her office and explained while I was talking, and she looked at me and with some suspicion and said, "I'll talk to you in a few minutes. Just wait outside." And when we went outside to a courtyard, and I explained what I was talking, and she said, "Well, there is a story here, but it's not the story you're thinking of." And what's that? And she led me on for months, and I was trying to figure out. But I did meet with her, and that's when she first told me about a young woman who was having the ongoing affair. And
Isn't it true that Lucienne knew you, and Lucienne told us that she told Linda, to reach out to you, that you were the person to...
I was already talking to Linda Tripp. It was, for months prior to that. I had never heard of Lucienne Goldberg.
One of the challenges in this story was
getting the story
utter
straight.
Complexity, because to bring that in, we had to bring in Kathleen Willey, and to bring that in, we had to bring...
Lucienne has that great mug and that basso voice. So it's sort of,
she is
watching her a little bit is
fascinating
kind
character.
of intriguing.
I mean, it was funny, just to replay some of this. I was talking to Linda Tripp, and you never quite know what to make of somebody. I mean, she was seemed to be genuinely angry about what Clinton was doing, as Lucienne Goldberg says in the film. She kind of established her bona fides for me because she showed me pictures of her in the Clinton White House with Bernie Nussbaum at the first Christmas party in '93. She seemed to have a good relationship with some of the Clinton people. So you never know what quite to make. But I do remember very vividly, and I wrote about this in Uncovering Clinton, I knew nothing about any taping. And then at some point of months, I get invited to a meeting at Jonah Goldberg's apartment in Adams Morgan, Jonah being Lucienne's son, and said, they have something they want to play for me, tapes. And that's when I first learned that they've started taping. And my initial reaction was, this is starting to get a bit creepy. Like, what is going on here? And they wanted to play me the tapes that day, and something about it just didn't feel right to me. And it was clear the taping was ongoing, and I was afraid I was going to get sucked into something even deeper than I was already sucked in, and I pulled back. Now, of course, cut to 2 or 3 months later, because that was October, when I discover that Starr has jumped into this and opened up a federal criminal investigation based on it, and expanded his mandate, and was trying to sting the president using Lewinsky, that's when, that was the blockbuster story. I mean, that's my other small quibble. The quote from there makes it seem like the blockbuster story was Monica. I had no way of proving the Monica-Clinton relationship. I knew Linda Tripp had told it, had talked about it. I knew she had told me all sorts of wild stories, including the fact that she had a blue dress in her closet, which she wanted to give to me at one point. I said, what am I going to do with it? But the one thing I knew is that Starr opening up an investigation on this was a story, and was going to rock Washington, and was going to make the town come apart. And
I thought you talked in 2-minute sound bites now.
But, yeah, sorry. Anyway, okay, that's you get me going on this, and I'll keep going. Right.
Well, I want to let's go from the specific to the cosmic, and if I can ask Barak Goodman, the cosmic question: what is Bill Clinton's legacy? I mean, we could talk about Monica all night. We could talk about the Starr investigation and impeachment. What do you think his legacy will be as the person doing the second draft of history here?
Well, I don't want to cop out of that question, but I like what John Harris says at the end of the film when he says that Clinton will be an argument without end. And I think that that's true. I think that as David said, that this is such a contradictory figure. He did so much good, and yet the bitter partisanship that we have in Washington today, the lack of trust in government, one can make an argument that that began in the Clinton administration. It wasn't entirely Clinton's fault, God knows, but he contributed to it with his own actions. So, I think generally my guess will be that he'll be regarded positively in history. Well, it was a time of unparalleled prosperity and peace, and if a president deserves credit for that, he'll get credit for that, and he should. But there was a real erosion in trust that at least partly can be laid at his feet. So it's a mixed bag, I think.
Well, I'd like to ask.
Historians now have him, almost at the top third of the presidents. So that's not a bad place to be, less than a decade after impeachment. But the culture around him, I think, is what might last as much as his actual events as president. I mean, he's sort of the first postmodern president. I remember when Isikoff and I both were down in Little Rock in 1992 when he was running, and you would get, opposition research was just starting, but it would come by fax machine. Remember? I mean, so now it's just 100-fold times more of this. And so the dysfunction of the modern government and this incredible machine of misinformation and information and total BS and mythology, it really starts with Clinton in a lot of ways.
Well, and there's another side. You mentioned the economic, the foreign policy, and I was taken by that part of the documentary, which is really the lesser known part of Bill Clinton, his maturation from the disaster of Black Hawk Down, and watching what happened, what he allowed to happen in Rwanda, to becoming a mature president on foreign policy. Can you talk about that a little, and then if I could ask Michael to chime in?
Yeah, well, like everything else with Bill Clinton, he was a tremendous learner. He learned on the job like no president, I think, in modern history. The difference between his first 2 years and the rest of his administration is stunning. And that's in large part because of his own ability to learn from his mistakes. And I think in foreign policy, it's no different than in domestic policy. He began to understand what levers to pull, when to pull them. He began, most importantly, to apply the lessons of politics to foreign policy. He knew how to persuade people. And when he began to see foreign policy and foreign leaders as just another constituency to win over, that's when he really began to succeed in foreign policy. He charmed the Europeans into supporting his Bosnia policy, essentially, and that was the beginning. But and Northern Ireland and many other cases, he really applied that personal charisma to foreign policy, which I think turned the tide, really, for him.
And Michael, what was your experience?
Well, I just want to say, I mean, look, there were triumphs, and you mentioned a couple. I mean, Northern Ireland and Kosovo. But one of my substantive criticisms actually is the dealing with Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, because you do have the story in there that Richard Clarke tells of how. Remember, the embassy bombings is right when Monica is, the Monica story is really taking on its second life because Clinton has to confess, and it's August of '98, and there's a question of, there's debate about what to do, and Clinton, as Richard Clarke tells the story, says, we're not going to worry about the politics of this, we're going to strike, and there's the cruise missile strike against the camps in Afghanistan, and also the chemical plant in the Sudan. And that's right, and I'm sure Clarke has it right, but there is the sort of rest of the story, what happened after that. Of course, they missed Bin Laden, they missed getting any Al-Qaeda leaders. There's continued debate about what to do, how to handle it, but what comes next? October 12th, 2000, the bombing of the USS Cole, 12 U.S. sailors killed, Al-Qaeda strikes again. Clinton goes out that day and says, whoever did this, we will not find safe harbor, we will hunt you down, there will be justice, and he does nothing. There is no retaliation for the bombing of the USS Cole, and of course, this continues under Bush as well, in which there's nothing for 9 months, and the failure to retaliate at that time, and Clark and his deputy Roger Cressy will tell you, emboldened bin Laden. There were al-Qaeda videos based on the bombing of the USS Cole. It became a recruitment tool for al-Qaeda, and it sort of paved the way for 9/11. So the record on 9/11 and terrorism is I think, a little more mixed. Yes, it's true, he did focus on it at that time, yes, during the millennium, but the follow-up was not there.
So I can detect that we have an audience of 2 for the 10-hour version.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
These are all levels of nuance, though, in some ways. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
there's only so much you can do with a documentary.
right. No, I understand. I'm just, look, I think it's a great
Well, his
film.
record on terrorism is definitely up for debate. But
and I have one more question for Barak Goodman, and then we will take questions from the audience, so get ready to ask. But the last question I have is, you saw Al Gore in some of the clips there. I mean, he's sitting next to the president, or he's in the background, but he's not really a major player in the documentary. Hillary Clinton is, of course, the vital player. You have a lot of very interesting inside information from Dick Morris. What's your view on Gore? Is it because you only had 4 hours, or because you had to sort of pick who the most important people were in the Clinton White House?
Well, there are a couple answers to that. Gore is one of the handful of people who declined an interview. I have to say that this is a criticism of the documentary that I may agree with. I think Gore was extremely important. I don't think there's any question of that. I think Gore may have been the most important advisor outside of Hillary, and he was right about things an awful lot. Boy, his batting record, batting average in the White House was extraordinarily high in terms of his advice.
He said, "Don't do healthcare first."
He said, "Don't do healthcare first." He was dead on the shutdown. He was correct in many ways on the handling of Whitewater. He was very, very, very influential, and it was definitely a function of the fact that we only had 4 hours. It was a function of the fact that he declined to be interviewed, and there's just so many. And it was also a function of his personal style. He's always in the background. He's very quiet. So for all those reasons, he receded a little bit.
Because you could see him. You could see him right off the center of the
Yeah, he was
photo
always
so many
there,
times.
Zelig-like,
Yes.
yeah.
If I could add
Yes.
one thing to the scene where they're confronting Gingrich, and you have Panetta giving that, sort of, this is Clinton's moment. Well, Gore pushed him to that moment. And what Clinton really said to Gingrich was, I don't care if my popularity goes down to 5%,
Right.
I'm not giving in here. And so that's what everybody heard. And afterwards, Gore came up to him, put his arm around him, and said, that was exactly right. This is the moment you should have said, I don't care if it goes down to 0%, and we're not giving in. And Clinton put his arm around Gore and said, no, 4%, and I'm caving.
So do you think Al Gore needs to put his arm around Barack Obama right now? I mean, are we getting, in your view, are we getting close to that moment where
Well, one of the interesting
Republicans are
things I
pushing the
think
envelope?
everybody would agree is to remember how much Clinton did give before
Yeah.
he stood.
Right.
And so, when you think Obama's giving, there is a precedent there that Clinton, and Clinton eventually won it.
So anyone have a question? Okay. Are you going to, Havel, are you going to do? Oh, okay, if you can line up over here then. So you go to the microphone as opposed to the microphone coming to you.
Good evening. Mark, question for you. So we're in an era where tonight on HBO, you have perhaps the polar opposite, filmmakers who want to be involved in Paradise Lost in a case, and they're advocates in effect. Here you've got the extraordinary timing of the primaries, Newt Gingrich running. You think about it, you don't think about it. How in public television and in your shoes, and you've done a number of these wonderful documentaries, how do you handle this remarkable coincidence?
You don't claim that you saw it because you don't. Who knew that Newt Gingrich was going to be hanging on to this time. So it's, but what you do know is that that Clinton is from the more very lived past and that recent past, and that he's going to continue to resonate. I think we were much more concerned about calibrating at this time with regards to Hillary being in her position. We had some sensitivities when we did the George H.W. Bush program because his son was in the White House at the time. But it felt a little bit closer to the bone here. So, I think those are the concerns that you don't, the marching orders that Barak got were pretty clear. Park your agenda and your background and your perspective as much, and your feelings, really, political leanings, at the door, as much as you humanly can, and let's look at this afresh. It's been 20 years now since Bill Clinton was out there scrapping and scraping by on the primary field, race, and it's just enough time for some dust to settle, and it's just enough time to try to take a step back and look at it. And just if I could just offer my 2 cents on his legacy, I think he's going to be viewed as the first president of the media age. He walked into the birth of the 24/7 cable news cycle. He also came into office at a time of bitter partisanship. And I think those two things created such toxic waters in Washington that he was the one that had to navigate them the first. And we're still living in those toxic waters today.
Well, in that context, if Clinton's political opponents hadn't fanned the flames so furiously about Monica Lewinsky and Paula Jones and Jennifer Flowers and all the other women in his past, what do you think we could have gotten done in those last 2 years of his second term? And also I want Isikoff to tell the story of the Washington Post lawyer, the tantrum he threw when his editors wouldn't let him report on the Paula Jones case because they didn't think he had enough proof that, in fact, it happened the way she said it happened.
Okay, we'll start with the first and then 2-minute limit on the Washington Post.
David, were you around for my supposed tantrum?
I wasn't there that day.
I didn't think so.
Okay.
Well, look, there were debates within the Washington Post newsroom for a long time about how to handle that story, and there were people on all sides. And actually, at the end of the day, they ran the story. So, it wasn't a question. It was a question of how you handle a sensitive story, which everybody agreed was a sensitive story.
I can attest to the fact that wasn't the only fit he ever threw over the years. It's one of many.
As far as your other question goes, I mean,
and on the look, Clinton is such a polarizing figure. There were people who believe that all his troubles were the result of what his enemies did to him, and there are people who believe he's responsible for many of them. I think the film does a pretty good good take on sort of realizing that it's a bit of both.
And let's ask about the costs. What do you think?
well,
Eric?
I mean, Peter Baker talks about this in the film that this was a time of budget surplus. They were already talking about a entitlement reform, Social Security reform that would have fixed Social Security forever, for the foreseeable future. There were real costs to this. It wasn't just a nasty political fight that played out in the media. There were real substantive damage done to the country. I think the Republicans dug themselves in so deep on this, they went so far with it that there was absolutely no way that anything could get done after that. Clinton survived, and they bitterly resented that fact, and they were not going to work with him anymore. And I think that's a real tragedy that came out of this whole thing.
And if I can chime in, since I was covering the White House for Business Week then, I know Erskine Bowles, the chief of staff, really wanted to work a deal on Social Security. I mean, they saw it as the Nixon goes to China moment, both in terms of the biggest long-term problem with the U.S. economy and the question of Clinton's place in history. To be able to do something like that. And it just was not possible. It was not possible to get anything, to get the Republicans on Capitol Hill and to fight off the Democrats who had just saved his hide in impeachment to go along with something that would require that much sacrifice. So anyone else? Okay, Apple, you have a microphone?
Yeah, hi. Do you have any thoughts as to how things would have been different, how history would have been different had Clinton admitted wrongdoing and apologized to the nation a year earlier than he did? And we would have skipped so much of the investigation, and love to hear your opinions on that.
Anyone?
Well, I just want to tell a quick story, and then I want to hear these guys. But my quick story is this, that Dick Morris, the one person that Clinton basically confessed to while he was denying it to the world was Dick Morris, who you remember had gone through a scandal of his own. He called up Dick Morris and he said, and this is in the film, he said, well, I didn't do what they said I did, but I may have done something. And so what does Dick Morris do? He snaps into action and he takes a poll. And he polled the question of of how the public would react to this, and he came back to Clinton and he said, this is the truth. If you admit that, it's not the action, it's the lying, it's the cover-up that the American people won't forgive. My advice to you is come clean. And Dick Morris is right about an awful lot of things, and he probably was right about that. And Clinton couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And I wonder, like you, how this could have been a totally different scenario if he had.
Dick Morris is wrong about an awful lot of things.
Now he's wrong about a lot of things.
No, I mean, even that he is.
Right. Well, he's sort of the Newt Gingrich. You throw up 100 things.
Exactly. I mean,
Actually,
yeah.
but the most fascinating part of that story is, at least as Morris tells it, this is the night that Clinton's just learned, just how bad things are and what big trouble he's in, and wants to go over all the numbers in that poll. Morris. Right. He said, "Okay, give it," and he's jotting it down as they speak.
So, what do you think, David and Michael? What do you think about this question?
Well, he wasn't going to do it, no matter what. I mean, I think even if the polls had said that this will help you, or you'll survive, I don't think anything in my study of his history that he would have done it then. But of course, in almost every case for all of our lives, that's true. That if you just tell the truth immediately, that it's always the best course. So I think it would have been a positive thing, but it just wasn't going to happen.
It's what we tell our kids, and they somehow don't do it.
No, I mean, it's much easier said than done.
It's so human,
Yeah,
I mean, it is the story of American politics.
Right.
But isn't it?
Well, it would have been impossible, I think, because first of all, if he was going to start going down the road of telling the truth about his private failings, he wouldn't be able to stop there.
Yeah.
And he knew that, and there was the ongoing litigation with Paula Jones. So
the context of the times made
he
it
couldn't have done it.
Okay. Any other questions?
In the corner.
I think we have, yes.
One of the issues that led to Newt Gingrich and the Republicans taking over the House was the assault weapon ban in 1994, prior to 1994. Did your analysis of the Clinton administration deal at all with how the treatment of the gun issue, the loss of the House, and then fast forward to a year ago when a congresswoman gets shot, 6 people get killed, 13 people are injured, but the gun issue is nowhere on the agenda because of what happened back in the early 90s, I think. Politically, it's become sort of a third rail. You just don't touch it anymore. But it's amazing to me that in this country you can have that kind of a phenomena happen in Arizona and there's no fallout. There's no fallout. Nothing happens. Is there any comment about that?
Okay. Yeah, very good question. Do you,
Well, we didn't specifically attribute the failure in '94 to the gun issue, although that was one of the main factors. But don't forget that he did pass the Brady bill. It wasn't a record of complete failure on the gun issue. I don't know, you know better than I do, how we've gotten to this point where the gun issue is off the table, it seems, and toxic. Absolutely the third
From
rail.
the reporting I've done, the question is absolutely right, because I mean the lesson that Clinton drew from that and Rahm Emanuel drew from that was that this is a political loser for Democrats, and we're going to get killed in rural states if we push this. And they stopped after, yes, they passed the Brady bill in '93 and the assault weapons bill in '94. Then they lost the House and they didn't return to it. And Obama stayed clear of the issue from the get-go. The assault weapons ban was in the Democratic platform for 2008, but when Eric Holder said something about it in the early months of 2009, and Hillary Clinton said something, when Eric Holder did, the message came from the White House: stop, shut up, don't talk about that.
It's a fascinating point, because there's really no issue where the public sentiment is different from what the perception of voting. You know, so now almost virtually every state has a concealed carry law. You know, even Wisconsin, where I'm from, this supposed progressive state. You know, and you can walk into the state capitol there with a gun. You know, it's really amazing what's happened in those 16 years you're talking about.
And to underscore it, in 1994, Jack Brooks was the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and he had an A rating from the NRA, but the Republican, Steve Stockman, ran against him because he eventually voted for the Brady law and the assault weapons ban, and he was defeated in a very Democratic district. And I think a lot of Democrats, particularly in swing districts or in the South, just realized no more of these votes.
There is a powerful moment in the documentary, not about guns per se, but about Oklahoma City and that bombing.
Yes.
That really is one of the turning points in the documentary, I think.
Yes, question over here.
Hi. With the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, I mean, I think Clinton made his own bed, but I'm wondering what you think about what the fallout says about the American people, and you know, if this had happened in France, or you know, what Italians tolerated from Berlusconi, I don't think it would have been as big of a deal. So I'm wondering what you think it says about us, the American people, and then if we've changed at all, if something similar happened today.
But don't forget, the American people were with him. It wasn't the American people that really became outraged by this as much as it was the politicians in Washington. I mean, when it came time for him to sink or swim in the impeachment, he had the American people. They were disgusted by how far, not necessarily how far, I mean, I don't think they approved of it, but they were really disgusted by the impeachment attempt and by the politicization of this, and by Starr, and by how far Starr seemed willing to go to prove a case. So I don't know if it was the American people being so different than perhaps Europeans might have reacted. I think that they understood his foibles, understood what had happened, and in the end, I don't know what you guys think, but probably were willing to forgive him for it. Yeah,
Clinton won the '98 elections, you know, and then the impeachment came right after that, and the elections were pretty much based on what was happening with Clinton at that point. So it's a little bit facile to say that you know, America's this puerile country. You know, I mean, it's obviously different than most European countries, and I think it's changed even in the 12 years since then, and will continue to. You know, Gary Hart was the first, Clinton was the biggest, and you know, of all that sort of story, and I'm not sure what would happen today.
David, don't you think that it is true, though, that time and again it's shown that there's a different bedrock of religion in America, that particularly than in Europe, and that we sort of want the full religious experience. We are puritanical,
yes,
at the get-go, but when a sin is committed, we want the confession, and then we're ready to do the absolution.
Yeah, it's the whole Oprah thing.
But you've got to go through the whole process here.
Exactly.
And
I think that's a good way to put it.
And I think that's what I think so many people forget, is that, you know, that there is actually a sequence.
Yeah, Clinton fit into perfectly the daytime story, you know, television drama,
And Newt Gingrich is your latest example. I mean, down to a religious conversion. So not only the apology, but the conversion. So, and who knows what will happen in South Carolina, the religious right stronghold.
I compare Newt Gingrich now to Slim Pickens on that atomic bomb at the end of Dr. Strangelove. You know, he's going down with the bomb to try to blow up what he can.
Anyone else have a question? Over here.
Hi. I'm curious, 20 years, dust has settled. We've all settled into our roles. You look back on 20 years ago, what the 1996-97 version of yourself would have wanted to report, how you would have wanted to report it. How would you right now advise your younger self to cover the Lewinsky scandal? And maybe a different way of getting at it is, looking back on it now, how did the press corps do in terms of how it reported the scandal? Where did it fall short? Where did it charge ahead before there was evidence or before there was really a story? How well did the press serve the American public and the presidency during that time?
Is it time to quibble with you now?
Yes, yes.
I picked up some quibbles.
Bring it on. Bring it on.
I picked up some quibbles. I guess that's directed at me. But you know, look, you can't go back because you got to look at the and you can always go back and say you could have handled this differently, you could have handled that differently. By and large, I think there was a lot of responsible reporting, and I think that you know, I don't have any major problems with my own handling of it. I do think that part of the reason there was the public revulsion and Clinton won the '98 election is because it got, you know, it went on too long and it got overplayed and people saw it nonstop on cable television. And, you know, at some point early on, people got it. Yep, we hear the story. You know, they processed it. And the criticism of the press is really sort of the continued drumbeat, which in part was because the Starr investigation was continuing, and so there was an official process that, you know, gave legitimacy to the story. But I think that if there's sort of important criticism looking back, I think it's the overplaying, the over-coverage of it that would be my major critique.
Okay.
In defense of Michael, I think he's a terrific reporter, and you would want him to investigate anything. And it just so happened this was the story at that time, and a lot of the things surrounding it were way overblown and pretty hideous and sick. But I don't have any qualms with what Isikoff did.
And I mean, I have two basic quibbles. One was in the immediate aftermath. That week I was at the White House at the briefings. So a lot of the coverage was, can Bill Clinton survive?
Right.
And the Sunday after on ABC's This Week, one of their co-hosts predicted that Clinton would be gone within, I think it was 10 days. And so much of it was what I call the ESPNization of political coverage. Mm-hmm. And that was in its infancy with the 24-hour news. So that's one. And the other was, being a Business Week reporter at that time, I cared about things like balanced budgets and Social Security and free trade deals. And I felt uncomfortable as a reporter, as there were 45 minutes of questions for Mike McCurry about sex and blue dresses and such, interrupting, because I didn't want people to feel I was in the bag for Clinton by changing the subject to something as unimportant as balancing the budget. So I do think that I mean, the same questions were asked 15 times, and so I would have liked to have a little more substantive discourse at the White House.
That's the nature of the press. I
Exactly.
remember maybe you were there at the '96 convention when the Morris scandal broke.
Right, exactly.
And Joseph Stiglitz, you know, Nobel Prize-winning economist, comes out to talk about the economy being flush and what's going to happen, you know, so wonderfully over the next few years because of that. And all the questions are about Dick Morris and toe sucking, you know, for about a half an hour. Stiglitz is just standing there.
Can anyone top that? Wait, okay.
I was just curious, given what you know now about the Clinton administration and the parallels you've drawn between the first 2 years of Clinton and the Obama administration, what advice would you give the Obama administration going forward?
Want to go for that?
I don't give advice to administration. Really, that's not what I should do. I mean, I think that, you know, Barak, by the way, he's Barak, Obama's Barak, but Obama's dad was Barak, not Barack. you know, he grew
And
up
I'm
in,
Barak in Hebrew, so it's all.
yeah. You know, but Barak said that Clinton was a great learner, which is true about everything except for the lessons of his own life. I mean, Clinton had a photographic memory. He could synthesize and analyze better than anybody I've seen. Obama's pretty good at it too, and he also is a learner. So I think that whatever advice I could give him, which would be worthless, I think he is figuring out now.
So you may have to wait 15 years to do the Barak documentary, but how do you, Barak, look at this?
Well, the one thing I would say, perhaps is that there is no underestimating or overestimating the tenacity of the political opponents facing both of these men. And I think what I'm curious about in kind of rewinding history is what if Hillary had been elected instead of Barack Obama? Would Hillary have had a better sense than Barack Obama did of the, I'm not casting aspersions, but the tenacity of the opponent? I think she would have had a better sense of it. I think it would have played out differently. I think Barack Obama, as David said, came into office believing, really sincerely believing in some kind of rapprochement or whatever with the other side, and it probably, historically, will be seen as naive. And I don't think she would have been naive.
I think that, you know, a big part of the appeal of Obama in '08 was that he would be able to transcend the political battles of the Clinton years. And, you know, I think if Hillary had won, it would have been just as ferocious as we've seen, if not more, I think.
But how would she have responded?
Well, she probably would have been much more combative, but
Right.
I'm not sure that would have tamped down the political wars. In fact, if anything, they might have escalated them.
And I think we have a last question over there.
Profit motive, and you know, in this age of mergers, Comcast is acquiring NBC News. You know, how does the fact that news organizations are a business first and a public trust third or fourth, how's it going to affect political coverage from here forward? Are we still going to get sex scandals first and Social Security and budget deals fourth or fifth? Talk a little bit about decision-making process within the newsroom among top editors because they're doing market research about what their readers want and saying, no story should be longer than 15 inches or 20 inches on the front page because we don't want to lose our, young readers who don't have a, long attention span. Talk a little bit about how the, profit motive is driving political coverage.
Well, I've never been in management, so I can't answer that. David has, so maybe he can address it.
I can only talk about the Washington Post. I mean, it's not a question of profit motive now, it's a question of survival for newspapers. And also a question of technological transformation, which has both positive and negative effects. I mean, when you have 150 journalists covering an event in Iowa and they're all looking at each other's tweets, I mean, that sort of packed journalism is just intensified by this new technology in a really unhealthy way, I think. And the attention span of the public, I bet, has diminished even more. It used to be, one of our editors said the average reader has the attention span of a bicentennial minute. Now it's probably a tenth of that. But nonetheless, the urgency, like at the Washington Post, there's been a couple years where they've just been at sea trying to figure that out and get past it. And I think that it's at that point now, and you'll see more substantive, deeper stories again coming back to the paper. But that's a totally valid question. But I think the profit motive angle is far less of an issue in the way you're framing it at a major newspaper. That has nothing to do with the content of the paper.
Yeah, I think the news business is a business, but it also has a news motive. And I mean, if I can just say for my paper, Houston Chronicle, and the Hearst newspapers, we have two presidential candidates if there was a budget, we have exceeded it, covering Rick Perry all the way to the bitter end. And so I think that is a good sign for journalism, that we are saying when there is a big story, people cover it. I think that your legitimate point is the way they cover it. And I think that's a discussion for another day. But I do think that there still is a view of covering big stories. Some of the little stories may get lost now and then, but I think the big issues, the big stories still do get coverage.
And to bring it back to this documentary, I mean, there's nothing commercial about this. So I guess if PBS started running ads all the time, then you'd have to.
We did cut it down from 10 hours to 4.
Can I get that video? Can I get the 10-hour video?
No, I think the bigger, for me, the bigger concern, because with my kids, even that I'm monitoring all the time, is what is going on physiologically when we're living in an age when 140 characters can somehow be a beginning, a middle, and an end. YouTube has got 90 seconds, sort of a long form on YouTube. And you begin to wonder, when you're constantly flitting from email to screen to screen to email to screen to screen to screen to conversation to halfway there and driving at the same time, what's going on with the rewiring of our brains, and when will we be able, when does concentration and attention start to push back and come back in, or because otherwise we're just going right off of something, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, thanks to all of you for being here. This has been a terrific evening. I want to thank the panel. So, special thanks to Barak Goodman, to all the good folks at PBS and American Experience. I want to say thank you to Anthony Shop for coordinating the event, along with Megan Cotton, a new member of the Press Club. And my 30-second ad, if any of you want to join the Press Club, if you're interested in putting on events like this, let me know. There are membership applications around. And we look forward to seeing you back here. We look forward to possibly at a book event with David Maraniss when his Barack Obama book comes out. And please watch the documentary on PBS, 20th and 21st of February. Good night, everyone.